and that is the entire TLS handshake and everything that occurs throughout that handshake in order to calculate the keys to protect application data. Alright YouTube, I'm doing it. I'm giving away the keystone, the main attraction, the crux of my practical TLS course. This lesson is the culmination of every lesson prior, and is what the entire course has been gradually building you towards. Now, there's a reason I'm doing this, and that reason will become clear to you at the end of this video. In the meantime, get ready for the most complete and the most thorough explanation of the TLS handshake done in the true practical networking style. We finally made it to the lesson that this whole course has been building towards. In this lesson, we'll be picking apart the actual TLS handshake. This handshake is what will build the actual tunnel which will protect bulk data transfer between the client and the server. Now, I want to give you a fair warning that this is going to be a rather involved lesson. Throughout this course, I took particular care to break up every idea and concept into small, bite-sized chunks. But breaking up the handshake into multiple different lessons might detract from understanding how it all fits together. So instead, I chose to do the entire TLS handshake in one longer lesson. I'd recommend being nice and alert before you start, and let this be the first lesson you watch of the day, instead of something you watch at the end of a series of other lessons. So grab yourself that cup of coffee, do a few stretches, and let's get to it. We're going to illustrate the TLS handshake on a record-by-record basis. Recall that records don't necessarily correlate to packets, meaning sometimes multiple records will fit inside a single packet, and sometimes multiple packets will be used to send a single record. We're going to show you the handshake in its most basic form, meaning a TLS handshake using an RSA key exchange. The lessons that follow in this module will show you different variations of this basic handshake. But we're only going to show you how those variations are different to the handshake we're going to discuss in this lesson. So make sure you very thoroughly understand everything we discuss in this video. That being said, it is now time to show you the entire TLS handshake that will occur between this client and this server. Throughout this handshake, the client and the server are going to exchange and calculate certain values. We're going to show you the pieces of information that each party has in these two boxes. To begin, the server already has a few pieces of information. Namely, the server has its own certificate, the server has its own public key, and the server has its own matching private key. With this as our starting point, we can now show you everything that occurs in the TLS handshake. Keep in mind, everything we're about to show you occurs every time you visit an HTTPS website or connect to an SSL VPN. The first message of the TLS handshake is the client hello. Inside the client hello are 5 different fields. This version number is going to include the highest version of SSL that the client supports. Meaning, if the client supports TLS version 1.3, it's going to send in this field the hex code 0304 to indicate that it supports TLS version 1.3. This random number is 32 bytes generated by the client. The first 4 bytes of that is going to include the timestamp down to the second. What this does is it makes it impossible for 2 different client hellos sent more than a second apart from each other to have duplicate random numbers. Then we have the session ID. The session ID is an 8-byte value used to identify this specific session. We're going to explore the inner workings of the session ID when we discuss session resumption later in this module. For now though, for this simple version of the handshake, the client will send a session ID of all zeros. Or sometimes the client won't include an actual session ID. This will prompt the server to randomly generate a session ID to use as a reference for this particular TLS session. Which brings us to the Cipher suites. We discussed in the last module how the Cipher suites work. The client will send a list of ciphers that the client supports in the order that the client prefers, and the server will pick from this list. And finally, if any additional extensions are going to be included in this particular session, it would be done in the client hello. For this version of the handshake, we will proceed with an empty extensions field, indicating no additional extensions are being requested. But in later lessons in this module, we'll be showing you various handshake extensions and how they will affect this core handshake that we're illustrating in this lesson. So those are the 5 fields in the client hello. Upon receiving the client hello, the server will then respond with the server hello. And the server hello happens to have the exact same 5 fields. The version number in the server hello will indicate the highest version of SSL that the server supports. This random number is also 32 bytes with the timestamp down to the second encoded in the first 4 bytes. The session ID sent from the server is going to be a randomly generated value that will be used to identify the ensuing session keys. This value is purely arbitrary. It's simply going to be used as a label to reference this particular session. The server will then select a cipher from the list that the client suggested and echo it back to the client in the Ciphers field of the server hello. And finally, if there are any extensions that are going to be included in this particular TLS handshake, this is where the server would provide the necessary information back to the client. And again, in this particular illustration, we're going to exclude all the additional extensions that exist. At the end of the client hello and the server hello, both the client and the server now have additional pieces of information. Both know the highest version of a TLS that is mutually supported. Meaning if the client sent TLS version 1.3 in its version field, and the server sent TLS version 1.2 in its version field, that tells both the client and the server that the highest mutually supported version of SSL is TLS 1.2, and both the client and the server will continue the negotiation using the TLS 1.2 handshake. Moreover, both the client and the server are going to know both random numbers. The client knows the random number it generated and sent to the server, and it knows the random number that it received from the server. In the same way, the server knows the client number that was sent by the client, and the server knows its own random number that it randomly generated. So both the client and the server know both random numbers. They also both know the session ID that will be used to reference this particular session in the future. And finally, they both know the mutually agreed cipher suite that will be used to protect the bulk data transfer in this TLS session. Now, we'll take a quick pulse check right here. Go ahead and pause real quick for a moment and make sure you understand how the client and the server have attained the mutual pieces of information that we've just discussed. If you feel good about that, we can now continue. The next record in the TLS handshake is the certificate record sent by the server. And as you can infer, inside the certificate record is the server's full certificate chain. To be clear, if the server had 3 certificates and its end entity certificate, it's going to be sending all 4 of them in this message. It's not going to send 4 different certificate records. After receiving the certificate and certificate chain from the server, the client is now going to attain 2 new pieces of information, namely the certificate and of course the public key which was contained in that certificate. The next record that'll be sent will be from the server and is called the server hello done. This is an empty record which simply indicates that the server has nothing more to send at this time. There are other variants to the handshake in which the server is going to send more content in between the certificate and server hello done, but the fact that the server hello done is sent right after the certificate is an indication that we are not doing those other variants. We'll be looking at some of those other variants in the next few lessons of this module. Now recall that after receiving the certificate from the server, the client needs to ask itself 2 questions. The first is the certificate legitimate? That'll be validated by verifying the signature in the certificate using the CA's public key. And at this point, the client has everything it needs to validate that signature. The second question that the client is going to ask is the server the true owner of the certificate? That is going to be validated by verifying that the server has the matching private key, which will be done using the next record that the client sends. That record is known as the client key exchange record, and there are 2 primary purposes for the client key exchange record. The first is to establish mutual keying material, meaning a seed value which both the client and the server will then use to generate session keys. The second purpose of the client key exchange is to prove that the server is indeed the true owner of this certificate. Both of these goals are going to be done using a special value known as the pre-master secret. Now notice this value is illustrated with this red dotted line around it. That's an indication that that particular value is sent encrypted. Let me show you how this value works. The client is going to generate the pre-master secret. The pre-master secret is 48 bytes and is for the most part randomly generated, except the first 2 bytes are going to include the TLS version that is being negotiated in this handshake. The pre-master secret is then going to be encrypted with the server's public key, which the client has because it acquired it when the server sent its certificate. The encrypted version of the pre-master secret is what's going to be sent on the wire, which means the only person that can extract the actual pre-master secret from the encrypted version that was sent on the wire is whomever has the matching private key, which our server does. Which means the server is able to take this and extract the original pre-master secret. Now, both parties have the identical pre-master secret. This pre-master secret will be the seed value from which all additional session keys for this session will be calculated. Now, what we've just described is how RSA establishes that seed value. There are other key exchange protocols that establish this seed value a little differently, and we'll show those to you in future lessons in this module. But for now, we're going to continue with the very basic handshake, which includes the RSA key exchange protocol. With that said, I want to show you what actually happens to that pre-master secret value. That pre-master secret value will be used as the seed value to generate session keys for this particular TLS session. Let me show you how that's done. First, the pre-master secret is going to be used to derive the master secret. That's going to be done by taking that pre-master secret and combining it with a few other values. Those other values are the client random number and the server random number, which were established in the client hello and the server hello, and the literal string master secret. It's actually written into the RFC that way. Those 4 values will be combined to create the master secret. Now notice that both parties have the necessary values to calculate this master secret. Both parties have the pre-master secret. Both parties know the string master secret, it's public knowledge, it's in the RFCs, and then both parties have the client random and the server random, which means both the client and the server are able to put together the master secret. That master secret is then going to be used to generate session keys, and it's going to be done by combining the master secret with a few other values. Those values are going to be the literal string key expansion, and then once again the client random and server random that were established in the client hello and the server hello. Combining these 4 values will lead to the generation of the session keys, and at minimum 4 session keys will be created. A symmetric encryption key and an HMAC key to protect what is sent from the client, and a symmetric encryption key and an HMAC key to protect what is sent from the server. And again, both parties had the master secret, both parties know the string key expansion, and both parties have the client and server random numbers, which means both parties have the same identical session keys. Now, you might be asking yourself, why 2 sets of keys? Well, that's a great question. What TLS is actually doing is it's creating 2 separate tunnels. One to protect all the data sent from the client to the server, and another to protect all the data sent from the server back to the client. In both cases, these are symmetric keys, meaning whatever the client sends will be encrypted and protected with these keys, and the server will use its copy of the same keys to decrypt that content. And in the other direction, whatever the server sends will be protected by those keys, and the client will use those same identical keys to decrypt and read that content. The benefit of all this is even if the client and their server send the exact identical duplicate datasets to each other, since they're going to be encrypted with different keys, they're going to look different on the wire. Moreover, if someone were to do all the hard work to brute force one set of keys, at best they're only going to capture and decrypt half of the conversation, meaning the conversation in only one direction, because the conversation in the other direction is using an entirely new set of keys. So that is how TLS and SSL will generate the session keys to protect the actual bulk data transfer. The main thought there is that TLS is essentially building two different tunnels, one tunnel to protect the data transfer in each direction. Now, I'll also mention here that if any additional secrets are required, this same calculation is what's going to generate them. Earlier, we discussed encryption protocols in the Cipher Suite module. We mentioned that certain encryption protocols require what's known as an IV, or an initialization vector. Well, this is the step that's actually going to calculate any necessary IVs. Of course, you might be asking yourself now, how is this one calculation going to generate all the necessary keys and IVs that we need for this session? Consider, sometimes we're using a 128-bit encryption protocol, which only needs 128 bits for each of the encryption keys, and other times we're using 256-bit encryption keys, in which case we're going to need two sets of symmetric keys that are each 256 bits. Well, the way it works is that these values are combined in what's known as a PRF, or a pseudo-random function. A pseudo-random function is sort of like a hashing algorithm, but it creates a digest of any length you want. Internally, a PRF includes a hashing algorithm that feeds back in on itself, which means you can run the PRF for as long as you want to generate as many necessary bits as you need for all the secrets for this session. But just like a hashing algorithm, the only way to get an identical bit stream is to have identical starting values. Meaning, only whoever has these four values can generate this exact set of keys that was generated in this session. That wraps up all the events that occur as a result of sending the client key exchange. So far in the handshake, we've discussed these 5 records. And now is another good time to take a quick pulse check. Go ahead and pause right here for a moment and make sure you understand how the client and the server have attained this most recent set of values, and in particular, how they calculated the session keys, which will be used to actually protect bulk data. If you feel good about that, then we can continue. At this point in the handshake, both the client and the server have identical session keys. However, at this point, neither of them know that the other has the correct keys. The client simply sent the client key exchange and then calculated the necessary keys, but hasn't received anything from the server confirming that the server has the correct keys. In the same way, the server simply received the client key exchange and went through these calculations, but still hasn't received anything from the client to prove that the client had the right keys. The purpose of the rest of the records in the handshake is to validate that each party has the right set of keys. And that's going to start with the client sending the change cipher spec record. This record is an indication that the client has everything it needs to speak securely, meaning it was able to calculate the session keys. You can read this record as the client saying it is ready to change to the cipher that they have specified in the client and server hello. Now notice that this record is in black. That's there to indicate that this is not a handshake record. Remember that the change cipher spec is another record entirely. Following the change cipher spec, the client is going to send the finished record. The finished record is a handshake record and is going to be used to prove to the server that the client has the right session keys. That's going to be done using a special value known as the encrypted verification. Let me show you how that is constructed. The client is going to calculate a hash of all the handshake records that have been seen so far. So if we pull back down our handshake, at this point in the negotiation, there have been 5 handshake records that have been sent so far. The client hello, the server hello, the certificate, the server hello done, and the client key exchange. So all the content of all 5 of those handshake records will be hashed together, and that's going to create what I'm going to call a handshake hash. Then that handshake hash is going to be combined with a few other values to create what I'm going to call verification data. Those other values are the literal string client finished and the master secret. Those will all be combined in a PRF to create the verification data. And finally, the verification data will then be encrypted with the client session keys. That's what's going to create this encrypted verification which was sent on the wire. In theory, the server saw the exact same handshake record so far, so the server is also able to put together this exact same handshake hash. The server also knows the string client finished. Again, it's built into the RFC, so that's public knowledge. And the server has the master secret, which means the server is able to put together this same verification data. The server will then take what was sent on the wire, decrypt it with its copy of the client session keys, and if the result of that is identical to the verification data that the server put together, this tells the server that the client definitely has the same session keys. Moreover, calculating the handshake hash from what was seen or sent by the client or the server also proves that the client and the server saw the same handshake records. If someone had tampered with the client hello after the client had sent it and before the server had received it, this verification data on either side of the wire would not match. So using the handshake hash in this way proves that no one messed with the content that was sent to negotiate this particular session. So that is how the client will prove to the server that the client has the correct session keys. So at this point, the server knows the client has the correct session keys, but the client still doesn't know that the server has the correct session keys. So this same process will now be done, but from the other direction. The server is going to send a change cipher spec record, and then the server is going to send its finished message, which is going to include its own encrypted verification data. Just like before, the change cipher spec record is not a handshake record. It's simply a record that is there to indicate that the server has everything it needs to start speaking securely, and the finished message will be there to prove to the client that the server has the correct session keys. This encrypted verification is put together in a similar way as to the one that the client sent, but for the sake of thoroughness, I'm going to show it to you. Just like when the client did it, the server is going to calculate a hash of all the handshake records that have been seen so far. If we bring back down our TLS handshake and count out all the handshake records that have been sent, we have the client hello, the server hello, the certificate, the server hello done, the client key exchange, and the client finished. All the content of those handshake records will be combined in a hashing algorithm, and the result of that will be a handshake hash. And once again, as long as both the client and the server saw or sent the same records, both the client and the server will be able to put together the identical handshake hash. That handshake hash is then combined with other values to create the verification data. Those other values are the literal string server finished and the master secret, which both the server and the client have, which means both the client and the server are able to put together the identical verification data. That verification data is then going to be encrypted by the server using the server encryption keys and then sent on the wire. The client will then take what was sent by the server, decrypt it with its copies of the server session keys, and verify that it matches what the client calculated as the verification data. That will prove to the client that the server has the exact same set of keys that the client expected. So at the end of the server finished message, the client has the necessary proof that the server has the right session keys. Which means, at this point in the handshake, both the client and the server have calculated the correct session keys and have proven to each other that they have the correct session keys, which means there's nothing further to do in the handshake, and they can now start sharing bulk data with each other, protecting that data with the session keys that they have negotiated. And that is the entire TLS handshake and everything that occurs throughout that handshake in order to calculate the keys to protect application data. If you've made it this far, then you should give yourself a round of applause, because we just covered a lot of information. I would highly recommend watching this video again to make sure it all sinks in. Remember, this TLS handshake that we just discussed occurs every single time you browse to an HTTPS website or every time you connect to an SSL VPN. In the remaining lessons of this module, we're going to look at variations to the handshake we just discussed. These variations are going to include different key exchange protocols, different features, or different extensions. But understanding the core handshake that we just illustrated is crucial, because when we show you the variations, we're only going to show you how they are different. So again, I would highly recommend giving this video a watch one more time to make sure it all sinks in before you start watching the other lessons in this module. Moreover, before you get to the other lessons, there's also a lab that you're going to have to complete, which goes with this particular lesson. In your next lab, you're going to be inspecting a TLS handshake in Wireshark. You'll get to see and pick apart each of the records we discussed in a real live capture of a TLS session. There will also be some questions for you to answer to help guide your exploration of the TLS handshake. So you have that to look forward to. I hope you enjoyed that lesson. It's the culmination of what every lesson prior in the course was building towards. If as you were going through that, there was any part of it that left you asking other questions, well, I guarantee you that there's probably another lesson earlier in the course that spoke to your question exactly. What you just saw was the handshake for TLS versions 1.2 and prior. TLS 1.3 came out a few years ago and is slowly building traction on the internet. TLS 1.3 is a major departure to how we did internet security before. Plus, it's going to be used everywhere, not only with just browsing the web, but also in QUIC, the new layer 4 protocol. So wherever you work in the internet ecosystem, you will definitely come across TLS 1.3. All the illustrations and all the details you just saw in the TLS 1.2 handshake, I'm going to do again with the TLS 1.3 handshake. And to motivate myself to finish, I'm going to discount my practical TLS course to the lowest price I've ever offered until I finish the TLS 1.3 module. Purchasing the course now will give you instant access to everything already published and all the TLS 1.3 content that I'm currently creating as we speak. So if there's any part of you or your job responsibilities that require in-depth knowledge of TLS, this is an absolute must-buy course for you. But don't wait too long, because as soon as I finish the TLS 1.3 content, the course is going back to its full price. I hope you got a lot out of this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the Practical TLS course.